Hello and welcome along. So we're going to talk about the Death Watch and their origins. So the Death Watch didn't come into being until about 1500 years after the Grey Knights, but they fulfill a somewhat similar role in that they are the military arm of a order of the Inquisition. So the Death Watch are the chamber militant of the Ordo Xenos and were created for this purpose, to be a specialized anti-Xeno force that would fight in small elite teams and take on tasks which were either too secret or too important for other forces to do. So although the Death Watch do have some similarities to the Grey Knights in that they are an elite force of Space Marines, they do work hand in hand with the Inquisition, and in many ways you could say they serve the Inquisition, although that's not exactly true. There is a lot more independence for a Death Watch commander or a Grey Knights commander than it may appear, given that they are supposedly working for the Inquisition. But in essence, they fall within the Inquisition's structure. Despite these similarities, there's also some obvious differences. The three most obvious ones is, well, first of all, the Grey Knights are created separately, in a separate process, from separate recruits than other Astartes. They are elite from their creation. They are produced in a way that makes them fundamentally better than a standard Astarte. Whereas the Death Watch members are recruited from pre-existing chapters of Astartes. So they are a blending of all of the chapters that already exist. So they've gone through all of the same experiences of recruitment and implantation, even training and indoctrination into a particular chapter's culture. And they have all of that baggage, or you could say experience, that members of the Grey Knights don't come with. And so a new member to the Death Watch is already an extremely experienced member of another chapter. And in fact, they're picked for their veteran status and also for their proven skill in doing the job of what a member of the Death Watch will need to do, as in kill aliens. If you have excelled in your own chapter and proven yourself time and time again on the battlefield and survived, you may gain the status of being a veteran. If you're particularly skillful at fighting aliens and you've maybe survived several campaigns against particular Xenos, then you might have gained a level of skill that is even beyond the other veteran Space Marines in your chapter. And if you do all that, you might get picked to join the Death Watch. And that's the basic difference in terms of selection. So although a member of the Death Watch doesn't have that fundamental advantage of being a Grey Knight, they do have an enormous amount of skill and experience, which is what makes them an excellent member of the Death Watch. Now, these are two fundamentally different ways of recruiting elite forces, of building elite forces. So I think it's an interesting question to look at is, why did the Imperium choose to recruit the Death Watch in this way, instead of starting from scratch like they did with the Grey Knights and create a standalone force that started at recruitment and had a different process to produce an elite alien fighting force? Why did it choose instead to recruit from the pre-existing chapters? So to explain the origin of the Death Watch and why they were created in the way that they were, we have to go back to the War of the Beast. This was a time when the Imperium was under threat from the largest Orc invasion it had ever seen and suffered enormous defeats. So many Astartes were lost that the Imperial Fists were reduced to one Astarte. So this guy, Corland, who was immediately made chapter master, having risen through the ranks so quickly, people started listening to him. He started coming up with the strategy of putting together small teams of Space Marines from the broken remains of the chapters stood against this Orc invasion. And doing this, gained some success. He managed to slow them down. He managed to actually get some victories. This gave this strategy some attention and some credibility. It was almost really a strategy of necessity. These small groups of elite Astartes were only elite because they had survived. They'd come through the fire. You know, they were the ones that didn't get killed by the Orcs. And using their experience of not dying, they were actually better at not dying the next time they met the Orcs, and so on. And so they were refined each time they fought into being better and better at what they did, because the ones that made mistakes died. At least that was a theory. And they had to operate in small groups because there weren't enough of them to operate at large scale. And so they performed precision attacks. They would strike at important bases. They would kill important Orc war bosses to change the power structure within a group of Orcs so that they would turn on each other, or that they would go off in a different direction because a different orc took power and had different ideas. And this way they could manipulate what the orcs were doing and not have to face the full force of the orcs in one go in big, large-scale battles, which they just couldn't stand up to at this time. Now, eventually, the beast was dealt with. That deserves a whole video of its own. Out of the shattered remains of the Imperium that had gone through yet another enormous disaster, emerged this idea that, well, we're going to face this kind of thing again and again. And the Inquisition decided that they would take on the responsibility of dealing with the Xeno threat before it became too big. And they would need some kind of elite force to do this kind of work that could operate in small specialized teams and go out into the galaxy, find where the threats were building and strike before they became too much of a problem. And so they kind of adapted this idea that Corland had developed of using these small elite teams from across a variety of chapters who had different complementary experiences that could be put together and do this job. And so that's essentially where the concept came from of the Death Watch. And now, the Imperium being the Imperium, this took quite a long time of negotiations and lots of arguments over who was going to be in control, where the power really sat, etc. It needed all of the various chapter masters to come on board with this because they had to give up some of their best people to go and become the Death Watch. So eventually, the Inquisition and the chapter masters managed to come to an agreement, and this new unit, the Death Watch, was created. So this brings us to the second major difference between the Death Watch and the Grey Knights, in that they were created so much later. Well, why were they created so much later? Well, because it took something as terrible as the War of the Beast to force the Imperium's hand to do something new, because the Imperium doesn't do things that are new unless it really has to. So things have to go really badly wrong before anything changes. And so that's why. I mean, the Imperium's always faced alien threats, and in many ways, the Astartes themselves are a kind of an answer to those aliens. They are the specialized anti-alien force, because using Astartes on humans is actually a bit of a waste, because they're just so powerful that they can destroy enemy human forces very easily, usually. Really, the creation of the Astartes by the Emperor was in the anticipation of facing far superior enemies than just renegade humans. He knew the many, many terrible alien species that existed out in the galaxy who wanted nothing more than to enslave humanity or wipe it out, and that's the main reason that Astartes were created, to face those kinds of enemies. So during the Great Crusade, there wasn't really a need for a specialized Xeno hunting force, because that's what most of the Astartes were doing most of the time. Now, they weren't doing it quite the same way as the Death Watch would come to do it, in this kind of small teams, special missions kind of way. In the Great Crusade, of course, there were legions that specialized in small team operations that did border on doing quite similar things to what the Death Watch would go on to do. So if we think of what the Alpha Legion did, they kind of invented the term kill team. They created these small elite teams who would go off on assassination missions or sabotage missions. And that wasn't just against humans, that wasn't just against other legions, like, for example, during the Horus Heresy. They were doing that to the alien enemies of the Imperium all the time, destabilizing governments, causing internal conflicts, etc., to weaken the forces of the aliens before they could turn on the Imperium. So those kind of missions would have been probably the majority of their missions, rather than against humans. And doing this, they developed many of the kind of techniques that the Death Watch would later use, of things like having pre-existing bases that were in various parts of the galaxy, which you could go to if you needed to equip your team. So instead of carrying everything with you, you could go to one of these hidden bases, equip your team with all the weapons and ammunition, etc., that you might need, and then go on your mission nearby. It made them more able to react to changes in circumstances more. They could activate a team near where the problem was, and that team could always get the resources they needed to do the particular job. So these bases didn't need to be manned all the time. They would just be shut down, essentially mothballed, until someone needed to use them. And another legion that did similar things was the Space Wolves, who had a system near the end of the Great Crusade where they had these groups called watch packs. And so the Space Wolves watch packs were a relatively small group of veteran Astartes who were highly skilled and extremely dangerous, and were given the task of watching the Primarchs of the other legions by Leman Russ. Because he didn't really trust anybody and thought that any one of them could become a traitor. And so he sent these watch packs out before the heresy occurred. This wasn't based on, oh, Horus and these others have become traitors, we should probably watch the supposed loyalists now. This was before that. So this was during the run-up to the heresy. It was mainly in response to Russ's suspicion over people like Magnus, with continuing to use psychic powers after the Decree of Nicaea banned them, and for some of the weirder actions of people like Comrade Kurz and so on, and Angron, where it was obvious that they were on the edge of being renegades. But he sent them to everyone because, one, that seemed fairer, and two, he genuinely believed anyone could become a traitor, so they needed to be watched. So Russ, a very suspicious man, he assigns these watchbacks to go and literally watch for any problems in the other legions. That is similar to what the Death Watch do. They don't watch the other chapters, but they do watch out for any developments amongst the various aliens that exist around the Imperium's borders or in zones that the Imperium doesn't have control over or full control over, and just watch any hints of potential future trouble, like build-up of enemy forces or just increased activity, this kind of things, where they can then strike before that develops into a bigger problem. So you could argue that the Death Watch are kind of like a blending of what the Alpha Legion and the Space Wolves were doing during the pre-heresy Great Crusade. But, of course, by the time of the War of the Beast, the nature of the legions has changed considerably because, well, there are no legions anymore. There's obviously now there's many chapters, but the Alpha Legion obviously are traitors, so they don't exist. So, and the Space Wolves are much smaller than they were during the Great Crusade, and the watch packs have disappeared because there's no one to watch. The other Primarchs have all gone. So there isn't a direct equivalent that the Imperium of the time of the War of the Beast, or just after the War of the Beast, could draw upon to deal with this Xeno threat. And you could argue that the War of the Beast and just how badly it went for the Imperium gave them the kick up the arse that made them realise that actually we don't really have that specialised small team force anymore that could go and deal with these problems before they arise, except for the Grey Knights, who already have a very specific job of fighting demons. So we should create something that could do that just for aliens. And so you kind of put all that together and you get this kind of need to create them at this point, and to create them in the way that they did, to use that experience that exists within the current chapters, where you can suddenly create a fully functional force quickly, doing it that way as well, of course, taking the already experienced troops from these other chapters. So given that this was a time when the Imperium was really struggling, it makes a lot of sense. You put all that together, you get something that looks a bit like the Death Watch. Which brings us to the last major difference between the Death Watch and the Grey Knights, which is that the Death Watch is not a permanent assignment. You get assigned to be in the Death Watch, you get picked to be in the Death Watch, or volunteered by your chapter, and you go and serve, you take your skills to the Death Watch and they benefit from it, but you also learn new things as well, many new things about how to effectively kill aliens in all their forms, and eventually you go back to your chapter, where you can take that knowledge and in theory improve your own chapter's ability to fight against Xenos. They're not allowed to tell people a lot of the things you've done, but at least you've got that experience, that extra skill, etc., that you've developed, and you can use that. You just can't tell them about specific missions and so on. So the Death Watch is obviously a very secret organization because of the work they do, but also being part of the Inquisition. And so even the chapter masters don't know all of the things that the Death Watch are doing. And so they, even when one of their own comes back, they aren't allowed to just interrogate them and say, tell me everything they've done. I want to know all the missions you went on and who you served with and what the Inquisition are really up to, kind of things. You can't do that. But I suppose amongst all of the chapters, someone out there probably would do that. I mean, chapter masters have gone renegade on many occasions, so them stepping across the line of the Imperium's rule is obviously perfectly possible. But in general, the chapter master would respect that boundary and wouldn't try and force that information out of someone. But this lack of information does lead to some tension between the chapter masters and the Inquisition, because the Inquisition know just how important the work that they're doing is, and indeed so do the members of the Death Watch. They go on missions that literally save the Imperium. They divert massive alien attacks from reaching the Imperium or stall them before they even can build up. They do things that are literally life and death for the entire Imperium, but nobody knows about. And so they know how important it is, but the chapter masters that they have come from don't know that. They know in general the concept of what the Death Watch do, but they don't know the specifics. So it's quite easy to lose sight of what they're doing and how important it is if you don't know the details of the specific missions. It would be easy for a chapter master to start to think, I keep giving you my best guys, a lot of them never come back because they get killed, and I could really use them here because we're really suffering, because we've got all these missions to do ourselves that we just don't have enough troops to do. Every day we see more attacks on the Imperium and we're being stretched thinner and thinner, and I could really do with my best people staying here. And you could very easily see how a chapter master might start to think that I'm not going to send you any more people because I need them here. Not because I'm openly in rebellion against the Imperium or I'm wanting to start a confrontation with the Inquisition, but I am responsible for my chapter first, and I need to keep as many of my people here as possible so that we can be as successful as possible in the various campaigns that we take part in. That lack of knowledge of the specifics of what the Death Watch are doing will only add to that chapter master's doubt over whether he should release people to go and serve in the Death Watch. Maybe you could even argue that it encourages chapter masters to nominate people that maybe aren't the ideal candidate, because they want to keep the ideal candidates because they're some of the best people in their chapter. Whereas if you've got someone who's a bit difficult, someone you don't really want in your chapter because maybe they're just not up to the standards, or they're just maybe hard to control, or in some way you think isn't useful to your chapter, you might nominate them so that on the hope that it actually makes your chapter better, or at least not as worse as it would have become had you sent your 5 best guys, because you really want them to be hanging around and helping you improve your chapter. So there is a huge conflict of interest here for the chapter masters when they agree to let people go to serve in the Death Watch. And although, yes, in the long term, they might get the benefit of someone coming back who's even better than they were when they left, there's a reasonable chance that person doesn't come back because they just get killed because it's such a high-risk job. And chapter masters are essentially sovereign. Theoretically, they have unlimited power in terms of what happens to their chapter. They could refuse to send anyone, in theory. So the Death Watch recruitment structure is on relatively shaky grounds because the people they're recruiting from do have so much power and could refuse to send people. And they also have the motive not to do that because they're under desperate pressure themselves. And so it would make sense for them not to send someone because they could be in a situation which Astarte chapters almost always are, in that they don't have enough people to do what they're being asked to do. And so you put those two things together, a motive and the power to refuse. It's surprising that it doesn't happen more often, to be honest. So there we go. That is the origins of the Death Watch and a little bit about why they came into being and how they became what they are. Let me know what you think in the comments. That would be great to hear from you. If you'd like to see a full video on the War of the Beast, I am thinking about doing one, so let me know. Otherwise, like, subscribe and share, and I will see you next time.